Institute for Government. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm Director of our Better Policy Making programme here. This is the third in the series we've been running about how did we manage to, I think in Boris Johnson's word, gobsmack ourselves with the success of London 2012. And in this one, we're going to focus on the people behind the delivery of the games. I'm not going to introduce them now. I'm going to pass over to a very good friend of the Institute for Government, Evan Davis, who some of you will have known from the Today programme. Those of you that get up later will know from Dragon's Den and elsewhere. But he's also just done a series of programmes on infrastructure in Britain called Built in Britain. So we thought it was very appropriate for Evan to chair this tonight. The one thing I do want to do before I go is to thank very much our sponsors for this event tonight, and that is CH2M Hill, who you may find being mentioned a bit by one or two of the panellists. They are the people where there's a missing row, because despite the fact we're talking about on-time delivery, they seem to be being about to join us a bit later. So anyway, so if you can't quite understand about that. But anyway, without further ado, I'm going to pass you on to Evan to introduce our panel and to set the session off.
Okay, thank you very much, Jill. Well, I think I can say with a degree more familiarity than I'd like that in this country, when things go wrong, we tend to focus on the lessons very closely and learn all we can. And don't get me wrong, I'm in favour of a lynch mob as much as anybody. But I think it is very nice that when we get things right, we should sit back and we should sort of take lessons from that as well. There's as much to be learned from success as there is from failure, and we do sometimes focus on the lessons to draw some failure. And if there's anything that has been successful in our country's history in the last couple of years, the Olympics was it. And I think we all kind of knew it was successful after about 24 hours, and the transport worked and the opening ceremony was great, and we just thought, phew, it's okay. It hasn't, it started well and carried on that way. There are three particular issues that interest me in why it was a success. And I'm going to quiz our speakers on this. We'll give them about 10 minutes each to chat and give the issues that are important to them. The three that are interesting to me, I think, are whether or not decisiveness played a role in the success of the games, whether there was something about the governance structure that was just more decisive and things could happen more quickly and clearly, and not too bureaucratically. The second issue that interests me, which may well be related to the first, is the issue of accountability. Because it could be more decisive because it wasn't as accountable. And an interesting question is whether we can combine accountability and decisiveness. And often I think those two are in conflict. We end up making things so accountable that they become paralysed, the paralysis of analysis, you might say. The third area, which I think is a very interesting one to anyone observing government at the moment, is relationship between public sector buyer and private sector providers. From the West Coast mainline fiasco to G4S's role in the games, the ability to get things from the private sector and contracts that work, are delivered well, are not a rip-off, incentivize the right sorts of behaviour is a key one. So accountability, decisiveness, and good purchasing, I suppose, are the three themes that I think are very interesting. But our speakers will have their own. So we'll listen to their presentations. We'll have a bit of chit-chat up here, and we will open it up. We've got an hour and a half or an hour and 20 minutes in all. And this is obviously on the record, and you're welcome to tweet and all the sort of usual things. The panel, in case you don't know them, right next to me is Sir John Armitt, who was, and still is actually, chairman of the Olympic Delivery Authority. They were the ones who were responsible for building the park, delivering the infrastructure. And when I made my Built in Britain series, we interviewed Sir John in the Aquatic Centre, and he was probably one of the most impressive people I interviewed in the entire making of that series. And he got me into the Aquatic Centre as well before the games. Next to Sir John is Paul Dighton, who is now Lord Dighton, I should say, just very recently ennobled. And he's not Paul Dayton. So he's not Paul Dayton, he's Lord Dighton, okay? And is still actually chief executive of LOCOG, which was the one who organised the games itself, delivered the games rather than the physical infrastructure. And Paul has been co-opted into government, is going to be, from January, commercial secretary at the Treasury, which is why he's been ennobled. I should say Sir John has been co-opted as well as a result of his, it's two things, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Ed Balls' committee on infrastructure to help the Labour Party work out what needs doing on infrastructure, and the Howard Davis review of airports. Good luck with that. And on the far side is Jonathan Stevens, who's permanent secretary at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. I'm sorry, I had airports on my mind. I've either got departures or airports or other kinds of departures on my mind. And if Jonathan had thought it was all going to be quiet after the Olympics, the BBC decided to make his life more interesting, I dare say. So that's our panel. We're going to hear from them 10 minutes each down the line, and then we'll have some discussion. So let me throw to you first, John.
Right. Well, good evening, everyone. People often say to me, how are we going to repeat the success of the Olympics and lessons learned and all the other things? And one of the things I have to say to them time and time again is this was a unique set of circumstances. There are certain things about this which are not easily repeated. And I'll come to those in a moment. But what was not unique was that as soon as we'd won it and the budget was examined, there was a realization that the budget was actually incorrect. So that was pretty normal stuff, that you win something and then realize you haven't got enough money. What was unique, however, was the willingness then immediately to review the budget and accept that the budget had to be re-examined and got right. Why was that? Well, because we couldn't actually walk away. UK Limited could not walk away. This was one thing. You could walk away from an airport, you can walk away from all sorts of things if government decides to. You can't walk away from the Olympics when the rest of the world knows that you are going to be responsible for delivering it. And I think that was quite unusual in a government sense. And then the good thing was that, in fact, quite rapidly, there was an acceptance of and a development of that new budget. And an important aspect of that new budget for us, for the infrastructure side of things, was that it included a sensible level of contingency. And one point I would make is that, and this comes from my background as a contractor as well as having been a client, is that people make much better quality decisions when they've actually got enough money. And if you've not got enough money, and if you are terrified all the time of not having sufficient budget, then frankly I think you make poorer quality decisions, particularly in construction, because you'll try and cut your cost all the time and you'll say, well, we'll build it with 4 tower cranes when really sensibly you need 5. And therefore you are constantly shaving away, and as a consequence making, I think, poorer quality decisions. The government had obviously totally committed. The government, not only its government, but future governments. So there was a guarantee to the IOC. We guarantee we will deliver these games, regardless of whatever happens in terms of cost and everything else, you will get the games. And they were not only, in that sense, guaranteeing themselves, they were guaranteeing any change of government in the future. Now that in itself, of course, immediately really, I think, drove what became one of the unusual things about this, which was cross-party support. So yes, there was cross-party support because everybody thought it was the right thing to do and nobody wanted to be associated with it not going well. But in fact, if I'm blunt, there was no choice about cross-party support because whoever was in power was going to have to deliver it. And therefore, there was an immediate, I think, recognition that mutual support was probably a better game to play here, rather than one in which you just constantly criticize the other party. The other thing is that time was of the essence. And when time is of the essence, then all your decisions are made, and coming back to Evan's point about decisiveness, to a degree you have to be decisive because you cannot afford time to ponder, as one might like to on occasions, the right decision and keep on re-examining it and try and fine-tune it. You just don't have that luxury when time is of the essence. What the ODA did was broke the program down into what was referred to as 2-4-1. So there was 2 years of planning, 4 years of doing, and then a year for Paul and the LOCOG team to have the infrastructure available to them for testing and having test events at the end. So we set out to actually complete all the construction work a year before the games. The ODA itself did not exist prior, essentially, to us winning the games, and on day one there were probably, if you like, 2 people, and so it had to build itself up from scratch, and therefore an early decision, and reference has been made to CH2M Hill already, was seeking somebody to assist the ODA in delivery, and so the appointment of what was called the delivery partner, which was a joint venture of CH2M Hill, Lang O'Rourke and Mace, as in a sense, a management team who were there to manage the day-to-day delivery on the park. So we, having received our orders from Paul and LOCOG as to what size should basically an Olympic swimming pool be, and we occasionally might even debate that, but by and large we did as we were told. And then we would appoint an architect. The architect would produce an initial design, and then we would very rapidly move to, with CH2M Hill, trying to put some sort of budget around that, and then appointing a contractor. And the contractor would then have the architect novated across to him. So the contractor then had a responsibility to do the detailed design with the architect and build it. And they had a target price. And one of the key things, I think, was the incentivization, which was consistent through the whole setup. So the directors of the ODA were incentivized on time and cost primarily, and a few other things I'll mention in a minute, but fundamentally get it built on time and get it built within the budget. CLM were then incentivized as the managing partner with the same targets, and then the contractors were incentivized within what was called a target price contract to build the individual elements within a target and obviously on time as well. So everybody had basically the same incentives, and I think that is very important when you're trying to get alignment of objectives. The other benefit, I think, was that a lot of people wanted to be involved, and so we were able to attract very good people to the organization. And the contractors themselves did not want to fail because they didn't want to be on the front page of the newspaper as having been the contractor who let the side down. So they put their A teams on the projects. So you had good people from the contractors, you had good people in CLM. The ODA executive team was strong because people wanted to be involved, and equally they didn't want to let the side down. Another very important aspect for us was that we were given planning powers by Act of Parliament. And again, if we had not had planning powers, you would have had 4 boroughs, all with an interest in the Olympic Park, and clearly the potential for conflict of interest and what was going to be built and so on. So the fact that we were able to make, at the end of the day, the planning decisions and, in a sense, grant ourselves the planning consent for what we wanted to build, undoubtedly again ensured that we could complete on time. We procured everything through what's called the NEC form of contract, new engineering form. It's not that new, it's about 15 years old, but it is one which is designed to try and remove any conflict from relationships, and it enforces through the contract an obligation upon the contracting side to tell the client when he's got a problem as soon as he can see the problem, and it enforces on the client a responsibility to respond to that problem so that you resolve problems as you go rather than traditionally having an enormous fight at the end of the day. And as an example of the benefit of that, we finalized the account on the main stadium about 3 months after the stadium was completed. And we have now finalized accounts on probably 80% of the value of the work which was carried out for the games. final point I'd make is that, and this is one which, again, in terms of what are the, if you like, the lessons to be learnt, to my mind, one of the key lessons which was demonstrated through this project was the power of the client to create change. And as the ODA, we had a series of themes which ran through the contract, themes such as what we expected in terms of safety, what we expected in terms of sustainability and sustainable design, what we expected in terms of employment, and who was employed on the project, how they were employed on the project, and then also how much commitment was given to training. And we had targets for all of those things. We had targets which we published, and then we measured and performance by the individual companies every quarter. We had league tables, and the whole thing was very, very thoroughly measured and audited right the way through. And that, I think, and the results were very good. I mean, we probably achieved 95% of what we were expecting to achieve through those targets. So for me, it was a very good example of what the public sector can do in creating change through procurement. That's probably enough.
No, that's extremely useful, and you've told us really about the decisiveness element, because you did have a lot of powers and you didn't have to deal with all these pernickety local authorities and such like. You've also told us about the relationship to the private sector, and in fact, when we made the television series, you mentioned this new engineering contract, version 3, and so John mentioned it to me, and in fact, everywhere I've been since, that people have been talking about this as a new way of doing construction. So Crossrail is using it, and it seems to work much better, and just seems to be, and I believe we're exporting it, and the people in other countries are beginning to use it too. So that's a good procurement point. You haven't talked about accountability. Did you feel anyone was really looking over your shoulder at all?
Well, yes, just a little. And the key thing about the accountability was that every year we deliberately posted the 10 key targets for us in the next 12 months. And then we reported our progress on those with Jonathan DCMS in the quarterly reports, and then we published at the end of the year again what we had achieved of those 10 targets and what the 10 targets were for the next 12 months. So there was a very high level of transparency, and in that sense you are clearly very accountable to everyone, not only Parliament but to the public and anybody else who wants to take a pop shot at you.
Okay. Paul, so in this, so John is both he's a contractor of LOCOG, he's also a buyer of services, so he's in the middle. Tell us about give us your 10 minutes on how you view the successful delivery.
Okay, let me rewind the clock to the 6th of July 2005. That's when we won the games back in Singapore. And the reason we won that very tight competition was because we made a promise which was very powerful, which was to use the inspiration from the Olympic Games to inspire change, in particular to inspire young people to choose sport. And I go back to that because that promise, we call it the Singapore promise, was actually our compass right through the 7-year journey. Whenever we reached a difficult point on the way or a decision point, we said, okay, why did we do this? Why are we here? We are here to create an event which will inspire positive and lasting change, particularly with respect to its impact on young people. I think now we've had the Games and you see what it did, you can sense that we had an idea of what we had in our hands. But it's very important to remember how crucial to what guided us through the 7 years was that underlying promise, because it helped us decide what we really wanted to do and how to choose amongst our various priorities. The second reason I wanted to take you back to 2005 was, we went through an incredibly, arguably the most competitive auction the world ever holds to win the Olympic Games. So the amount of thought and preparation that goes into winning that puts you in a pretty good position to start, even though, as John said, we had to redo the budget. Actually, in terms of what we wanted to do, we had a degree of clarity from the beginning, which is unusual. I think the third reason to take you back is talking about accountability, we had, the IOC wrote us a host city contract. We were accountable for delivering the Olympic Games to them, and they knew what a good Olympic Games looked like and how it looked at each stage of the 7 years of preparation. Nobody here did, so it was really important that we had a close relationship with people who really understood what good looked like at each stage of the preparation, because particularly in the case of the organising committee, you don't kind of do anything till the end, so you're 7 years out there, it's really hard to know. And we had a lot of trouble with that, because John is incredibly front-ended, very engineering focused, you can cost everything, you can plan everything, you can show what we did. We were basically saying, we're going to spend over £2 billion, we'll raise it on our own, we may go through the world's worst recession while we're doing it, and at the end it's going to be terrific, and we've got a plan. But it's really unnerving for a government, because there's really very little tangible delivery through those 7 years, yet you're building up to a point in time where the UK is either going to be celebrated around the world or universally humiliated. And it's really, really hard to know. I mean, all the time with John, we kind of knew, you can see the swimming pool going up. Who knew what Danny Boyle was going to do that night? And I can tell you in the week before, with some of the rehearsals, even those of us quite close to it weren't entirely sure. Anyway, that's all really important. I describe it in part as the degrees of difficulty for this project. I mean, John's alluded to it. It's the mother of all immovable deadlines. So we knew the opening ceremony was going to be on the 27th of July, 2012. And you've got three variables in a project, right? The time, fixed. Usually isn't. Even when people go to war, they normally have a bit of room around that one. Cost, therefore, and design absorb all the volatility. And so those two variables get really squeezed when time is an absolute fixed point. It's also a charm, because everybody knows you're not bluffing, right? So that really helps. So if anybody says to us, I'm sorry, I can't do that, you say, so you're going to be the guy who stops us delivering the games. And surprisingly, it all becomes possible. So, on balance, the charm worked better for us than the curse, because we figured out how to use it. And of course, it's a huge thing. 26 sports at the Olympics, 20 at the Paralympics, 35 competition venues, but 100 other venues that we use for operational purposes or for distributing uniforms or accommodating people. 204 countries coming here for the Olympics, 160 odd for the Paralympics, 15,000 athletes altogether. I mean, there is just nothing like it in terms of its scale, all happening at once. So it tests every single resource you have to its capacity and your ability to coordinate it all happening at once. So, the question when you've got that mother coming down the road to you is, how do you carve up the elephant? So, I mean, the way we really approached it at the organising committee was to broke it down into 4 chunks of things we needed to think about. Number 1 was, we've got to deliver a great games. What does a great games look like? So you plan from the outcome back to today. So we really knew, what does a great games look like for all our client groups? For an athlete, what's a fantastic games? It has a lot to do with being able to focus without the slightest distraction on performing at your absolute best for the 10 seconds or 10 hours when you're on the field of play. Nothing else matters. If you're a journalist, what matters most? It's, can you do your job properly? Does your technology work? Can you get food when you need it? Can you get to and from the places you need to be on time with a reliable schedule? Etc., through the client groups, including the spectators. The thing that I take most pleasure from is that all the things that we're now celebrating as wonderful successes did not happen by chance, right? We knew the mix of beautiful new venues that John built, plus the beautiful temporary venues in Greenwich Park and Horse Guards Parade that we'd put up, was the most wonderful mixture which would blow the world away when they saw them all together. We knew that the way we'd chosen our games makers, our volunteers, and the way we trained them, they were going to be absolutely terrific. We knew Danny Boyle was going to put on an amazing ceremony. We knew that the torch relay and the way we were going to do it was going to set the whole country on fire and get it literally behind the games. So these things were not because it kind of worked out. Those outcomes were targeted from day one, and everything we did through those 7 years was just ruthless execution to deliver those outcomes. Of course, in order to do that, you've got to put in place planning processes, you've got to understand your scope, you've got to go from a broad planning to a detailed planning to a testing process, huge amount of testing, and then translate that into what we always call readiness, so you're then into action. So really understanding those stages and using each and every day to get you to a point where you know it's going to work on D-Day. So delivering a great game is number one. Number two, this is not just a project. You have to build a company like Shell in order to put on the project. So you've got to nurture and nourish the organization. I mean, the reason I took the job was because someone was essentially saying to me, you can build Shell from scratch and you get to choose all your own people. I mean, no chief executive ever gets to do that. It was just a wonderful opportunity. So we were able to choose people who could do this job, build a culture which was very team-oriented, firstly internally at LOCOG, and then I think we all, over time, spread the teamwork around all the partners. So by the time you got to games time, everybody just wore a London 2012 t-shirt. We didn't know whether you were working in DCMS, whether you were working in the ODA, whether you were working for the London Borough of Newham. You just had a London 2012 team shirt on. Absolutely, absolutely critical. We also had incredibly tight systems and controls. You know, we didn't run it like an event company. John alluded to the importance of procurement. I mean, procurement is incredibly important to us. It was the way in which you got all these guys who were trying to deliver bits of the games to go firm on what they needed, because they had to before you could buy it. It was the point at which, of course, you have maximum leverage on all your suppliers. So if you're clear in there early and you understand the market you're buying from, you not only get a great price and lots of flexibility, you at that point get them to do all the softer things you want them to do around sustainability, diversity, whatever, you know, what other broader goals you might have, and you can have a real impact if you do it at the point of procurement when they will do anything to be part of the games. So that's number two, nourish and build just a world-class organization with all the things you'd want in it, so it delivers the games to the kind of quality you'd expect great businesses to deliver a product. The third thing is you've got to tell people about what you're doing and take them on the way. You know, throughout the 7 years, just like John and his, his breaking it up into stages, you know, tell people what we're doing, why we're doing it, celebrate the anniversaries. You know, the press knew, okay, it's a year to go, what are they going to show us this time? Is it going to be, you know, bearskins on Horse Guards Parade lined up in 100, you know? And every time everybody knew we'd get together, say, okay, here's where we are, here's what we've got to do, we're on schedule. The other part of the message, and this is very critical with the games, everybody wanted to be part of it. And our job was to make it possible for everybody to be part of it. And it's a tough challenge because you only have, if you count the Paralympics, 11 million tickets, but everybody wanted one. And mostly they wanted the same one. It was either the opening ceremony or the 100 metres final. Everybody wanted to be a volunteer, but we only had 70,000. So you had to find ways to allow people to be involved. The torch was great. 15 million people lined the streets because it really caught on. There were lots of events in the Cultural Olympiad. There were, companies were very involved when they were suppliers. So again, finding ways to make it everyone's games, and because that's what they really wanted. And then the final theme was really what I always describe as enabling legacy. Our job was to put on the games. It's not to deliver legacy, but the promise, the why from the Singapore promise, why are we doing this? All about inspiring the future, of course, was intrinsically linked to legacy. So the inspiration from the games is absolutely the connection to legacy. So everything we did, we also tried to make legacy work. So we'd always work with John and his teams. Look, we may have wanted a pool that would work for the games, but we needed to understand how you designed it so it would make sense in the longer term. We needed to work with people so when we had the athletes here, we could inspire young athletes. We needed to work with business so that, when one of our sponsors got a deal, had the opportunity to win a repeat piece of business overseas based on what they'd done in the games, we could support them. Very, very important to sort of live through the promise of making sure the legacy's there. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Paul, thank you very much. How many people here actually saw the torch relay in the run-up to the games? Yeah, it's actually the vast majority. It's just extraordinary, isn't it? How many people went out? I mean, you've raised a theme which I think is very important, and maybe makes it good that you're going into government and politics, that actually focusing on the delivery is actually rather important in making objectives achieved. And perhaps in politics and policy making in general, we work too much about the design rather than the execution, which obviously, and sometimes the design is just sort of brass plate reshuffling without actually changing anything underneath, which would...
We call it initiative. I mean, initiatives.
Yeah,
I saw that when I came in at the beginning. Lots of people wanted initiatives because they'd hang off the games, and it was a press release. But
it's not really helping.
It doesn't really help.
No. So that's important. Just one thing though, on this theme of buying from the private sector, you didn't choose to talk about the G4S thing. I'd be quite interested in whether you would expect, when you have 6,000 contracts or however many you had, that one or two are going to not work. Or whether there was something particular about that particular one that was a fail.
No, it's an important question. I mean, you're right. We had a very large number of contracts, and actually the failure rate was tiny because for most companies, what we asked them to do was actually one of the most difficult things they'd ever done. In most cases, it stretched their capability because the games is really, really hard. So delivering catering to all that really hard. Some of the stuff we asked on, the temporary stuff we put up. If you remember the weather in June and July, we were erecting the biggest ever temporary facilities in Greenwich Park and Eton Dornay that the world had ever seen in torrential rain with the mud shifting. I mean, it was really hard. And to be able to do that was quite something if you remember the scale of them. So really difficult things. And in one or two cases, it was too hard for them. It shouldn't have been, but you talked about people concentrating on the initiative and not the delivery. That's actually the perfect summary of where G4S went wrong. They did not really think through how this was slightly different to what they normally did and how it needed attention in a slightly different way, and the day-to-day attention and having the right kinds of people to deliver something which was a little more difficult than they were used to just wasn't paid attention to. It was really no more than that.
Was it, because Sir John's alluded to the fact that sometimes going for the cheapest bidder and having people expected to do these things at a cut price leads to bad decision making in construction. Did you try and get away with too low a price on that contract? It was just plainly unrealistic, and actually if you looked at it now you'd say we should always have known it was an unrealistic.
No, it wasn't. They would have been well paid. In fact, we made a point of paying them well for it because it was. We actually,
said don't do it too cheaply.
We actually included in the bid a substantial chunk of money to build the organisation to deliver it because we understood they couldn't do it with their existing organisation. So it's pure execution, and the challenge is always could you have figured out sooner they weren't going to quite make it, and actually the answer was because of how intensively we worked with them, we did figure it out in time to make sure that our alternative could be put in place, which worked very well.
All right, well the third perspective I suppose is the government perspective. In some way you're the biggest buyer in this chain all the way along. So Jonathan, why don't you give us your perspective in the relationship between politics, policymakers, civil service and Olympics?
Well, thanks very much. Paul mentioned July 2005. I was working in the Treasury on public spending in July 2005, and the Treasury had bet heavily on Paris. To give the Treasury its credit, I remember the loud cheer that went up when London was awarded it, but in the Public Spending Directorate there were furrowed brows. Little did I imagine then that I would find myself accounting for all the public money that was going on in. You mentioned, Evan, the government as the biggest buyer, if you like, but many people might ask, well, what was the government's role, and was it just the bureaucracy that got in the way? But actually the reality was that, like many people could say, this project would not have happened without government support, be it political support, financial support, and delivery of critical public services to enable the Games to happen. But also, I think at the heart of our approach was a recognition from the start that while government was absolutely critical to successful delivery, government itself was not an expert, as Paul has said, in delivering events of this scale and size, and particularly not an Olympic Games. So now you might think, why on earth, with an event of this scale, should you give lead government department responsibility to one of the smallest departments in Whitehall? But actually, I think that was absolutely the right choice, because one of the things that DCMS knows about and is expert in is working and delivering through others. We know that you don't get the world's most popular contemporary art gallery by putting a minister or a civil servant in charge of it, etc., etc. So the first point I would make is about having real clarity of the government's role, what it was and what it wasn't. And in terms of what it was, I think it was around 5 key things. First of all, ensuring that there was political support, as others have mentioned, across the parties, and continuing political support through a change of mayor and a change of government. Second, it was around contributing to the clarity of purpose of why London, why an Paralympic Games for Britain in 2012. And government and ministers contributed to that sense of purpose that Paul spoke about, that was outlined in Singapore, the identification of the benefits that we were seeking to deliver, not just in London, but across the nation, and the sort of country in particular, modern, creative, diverse, exciting, a great place to do business that we wanted to reflect through the Games. Third, of course, and rather close to my heart as accounting officer, was providing public finance and accounting for it. So we accounted for the £9.3 billion public sector funding package. That didn't exist when I became permanent secretary. We were just in the point of realising and seeking to resolve that early budget crisis. My personal memory of that was, at the time, it felt that it dragged on for a long time. But it was absolutely critical to resolve that early and resolve it on a basis that was sustainable and lasting through the programme. And of course, to account for it. I haven't totted up how many Public Accounts Committee hearings I underwent or reports we had. There was at one time where it was going so successfully that actually the PAC chose not to have a hearing on an NAO report, which was unusual. But of course, the main bulk of public money went into the construction and the build, but it was financial guarantees that also underpinned the whole operation, and indeed, over time, we chose to deliver some of the services through LOCOG. So one way or another, 75 to 80% of the budget came from public sources, whether it be the lottery, government grant, council tax pay. So that whole area was absolutely critical. Fourth area was have an oversight of risk. With a project of this size and scale, it was unavoidable that risk at the end would come back to government. This, as John was describing, it was either going to be successful or it was going to be a humiliation for the country. And one way or another, there's no point at that point about saying, oh, that was that contractor's fault or that body over there was responsible. You knew that ultimately, if it was a humiliation, it would be the Prime Minister and the government who would be out there. And so one had to take an overview of risk and provide ministers with the means to assure themselves that those risks were being successfully managed. And finally, and importantly, we had to contribute to delivery. Whether it be public transport, whether it be the security and policing operation, whether it be the whole operation at the borders, requiring a completely new IT system delivered on time, within budget, within government, for the accreditation process, government had a critical role. And I'm continually coming across new parts of government that had a role. My discovery of last week was I was visiting a vehicle testing centre, which had the role of approving adapted vehicles. So they had to approve the adapted taxes for the Spice Girls, and very excited they were about their role. Sadly, the Spice Girls weren't part of the actual testing process. So clarity on the government role was absolutely critical, and clarity around the structures that would successfully deliver on all the objectives around the games. Now, actually, I think this can be a neglected area about thinking about successful frameworks and structures for delivery. It can be very easy for government just to leap and pick one favoured solution. But actually, I think it's worth reflecting here. These structures survived. Actually, the record of previous games is that structures and chief execs don't survive all the way through the game. So I think it's quite a testament to the thinking that went on at the beginning. And the current structure seems obvious, but there were lots of alternatives considered. There were structures that had it closer to government. There were structures that had ministers very closely involved in day-to-day decision-making. There were structures that tried to offload it from government, give it, for example, to the mayor entirely, even though most of the funding was coming to government. So the thinking here was about what's the requirement to deliver successfully. We need something that secures political engagement. We need something that delivers a strong control and accountability over public money, but also maximises the opportunities for the private sector to play a critical part and to contribute, and also delivers the freedom to deliver and the entrepreneurism and the creativity that comes with that freedom to deliver. So we had a central coalition brought together in the Olympic Board. We had purpose-built delivery bodies focused on different aspects of the programme in the ODA and LOCOG, a different relationship with each. We were closer and more over the shoulder with the ODA because they were spending the bulk of public money, and deliberately chose to give LOCOG a more distant relationship to enable them to operate effectively with the private sector. And within government, we had to have a purpose-built body that provided ministers with the oversight and assurance over the programme as a whole. And that was delivered through something that we created within DCMS called the Government Olympic Executive, that has already successfully, at the end of October, closed itself down. Now, thinking about that particular role within government, we needed the right capabilities. We needed an ability to understand big projects, to manage significant public finance. We needed a cross-cutting team that brought together private sector experience, financial experience, the experience of government and the civil service in delivering and bringing together a number of government departments to work together. And that was the organisation which we built up as a dedicated and temporary organisation focused exclusively on this project and therefore protected to a degree from the ongoing vagaries and delights of life within government. Alongside that right capabilities, I would personally put a huge emphasis upon effective and right relationships at the core of this. There were the formal structures. Actually, my experience of them was that if there were the right underlying relationships, the formal structures hardly ever had to be brought in, or were brought in to secure the formal financial and other approvals once everyone was in effect agreed on the right course of action. And I think that at the heart of this successful delivery was a guiding coalition that brought together key people from LOCOG, from the ODA, from ourselves, and from the Mayor's office. And if you look at that central team, there was huge continuity of personnel which built up really close and effective relationships. So we had confidence that everyone was working to the same objective. We understood the different roles of each. We could have at times very robust arguments, but emerge knowing that we were all committed to the same fundamental objective. Alongside that, particularly operating in the public sector, you mentioned accountability. We made a conscious decision, driven no doubt by the fact that we had to secure a significant budget increase at the beginning, to plumb transparency and accountability into how we would operate. So once we had the budget and we had then secured and agreed the agreed scope that was being delivered with that budget, we then, quarter on quarter, published how we were proceeding against both scope and budget. And that built up, I think, a huge confidence that there was openness and accountability around what was happening. So much so that when our new Minister for the Olympics arrived in 2010, Hugh Robertson, one of the things he said to me sort of about week 4 or so was, well, I've now examined the books, and it's exactly as you were telling me before. And that gives me huge confidence that I actually knew and understood, and that you were telling me the truth. And I think there is a really important lesson to learn there about transparency, and actually that rather suggests that accountability can build up confidence in delivery of projects, and therefore actually may aid decision-making in the long run. The other thing I think that is a challenge for government,
last one,
okay, is about being open and ready to change. And one of the things I've learned about is this project has gone through so many different stages. You've had to work in so many different ways, from planning to build to operational integration to delivery and through to accountability. Being prepared to adapt your structures at every stage to that, and sometimes adapt the people who are playing critical roles, is absolutely crucial as well.
Excellent, thank you, Jonathan. And I'm interested in whether were there occasions where the ministers who, in the end, were the ones who felt like they were taking all the risks, were you having to hold them back? Were they itching to interfere? You know, we know from the Dome experience, which wasn't really, we wouldn't have been having this meeting about the Dome. We know that you don't get ministers to sort of design a theme park, do you? And were they sort of trying to get their hands on? Was it difficult?
There were times in both directions, times when we were actually saying to them, here's something that you really need to take an interest in. There's a really big decision coming up about how we manage construction of the village or something which has huge financial implications. This is really something you need to take an interest in. I think, to be fair to them, they always recognised that they were not there to run an opening ceremony. They were interested in it. They invested heavily in it, and they made the decision.
Did they decide on, who decided on Danny Boyle out of interest?
That was local.
That was local, right.
Yes. Yeah. And I think there was a good understanding among ministers that they needed to stand back from that sort of detailed, creative or operational decision making, while still being prepared to have their say, and recognising that sometimes they need to sign the cheque.
It's interesting. So a real emphasis on delivery, and maybe that's the single biggest lesson out of everything that's been said. There's another thing before I open up to the floor that strikes me though as quite interesting, which was, if there's a sort of British slogan in a lot of these kinds of things, it's, if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And you try and do it a bit cheaply, you try and not be too ambitious about it. You just try and get away with it on the cut price. And in fact, it is conspicuous that we threw everything at it. And here's the crucial question. Do you, by aiming really high and trying to kind of make sure it includes all the things, sustainability, diversity, inclusion, it's going to be good, it's not just going to be cheap, does it end up better value if you do it that way than if you try and rush it and sort of get cowboys in to make it? That, I think, is the sort of the paradox. Is it cheaper in the end if you go in there with a slightly bigger budget and you go in with a slightly more ambitious scope? Any of you?
I would argue always yes. And I think we always talked about the legacy. And in every decision that we made, it was how is it going to work for the games? But then actually, how is it going to work? So it's got to work for 6 weeks. But actually, what you're building has the potential to last for 60 years. And for me, you can see it in little things. If you walk around the park and you look at the quality of what we call the hard landscaping, the quality of the steps around the river, the quality of the hand railing, it's things like that. Somebody said to me they walked under the bridges during the games and were staggered at the attention to detail in the design of what was going on under the bridges. And I think that's where you get the long-term value. And by investing in that, you've got something which you are going to be proud of, not for just 6 weeks or for 6 years, but potentially you're going to be proud of for 30 and 40 years.
And economists would accuse economists would say, oh, well, you just gold-plated this thing because we threw so much money at you that you just went in and had fancy trinkets everywhere, that we could have got away and done it much more cheaply. So I suppose that's the question.
Well, let me come back on that though, because I'm very value oriented. Because John's building the stuff that's there for the long term. You remember my budget was constrained by how much money I could raise. We were doing it in the worst recession we've had since the end of the war. So we constantly rescoped and found different ways to do things to fit inside the amount of money we had. And so, sort of to throw out a controversial sort of observation, if you'd have taken our scope and costed it up the way you might do for a normal project, I think I delivered £5 billion for 2.4 because it's very hard to challenge the scope because I was always just going to deliver it. We found 1,000 different ways to do it differently, to really think, well, do we need that? So, I mean, I can give you a million examples of choices we made. They're all choices consistent with the outcomes I talked about, but we decided we're not going to put any roofs on the temporary venues, right? So massive structures, none of them had roofs on. Well, it's gold plating would clearly have been to put a roof on, and if it had poured with rain every day of the games, would people have been so happy? Lots and lots of decisions we took, just balancing our priorities and balancing risk. Every day I was stopping people hiring bigger teams because my headcount drives your expenses in a business. I came from a business, every business many businesses are very driven by their headcount. It's not just the cost of the people. They accumulate other people and they do stuff that wastes money. So on the one hand, you've got the world's biggest project to deliver. On the other hand, you're trying to stop anyone hiring people. And you've got to understand just how much risk you're prepared to tolerate. Yeah. And we absorbed a lot of risk to save money by holding back that hiring. So there's don't by any means draw the conclusion that this was successful because we threw money at it. We were, ask anybody who works at LOCOG, we penny pinched every day.
I think it's about, as John was saying in his introduction, setting a budget that incentivizes efficiency. And there was a clear choice when the budget was increased. It could have been done piecemeal.
Well, that's the government could have added. Could have said 6 billion.
My own view, and this was informed by being, responsible for controlling public spending in the Treasury. You've done that. That would have incentivized a continual series of arguments about why do we need more cash. It would have meant that short-term decision-making was prioritized over long-term value. I think the critical decision that actually drove a lot of thinking about efficiency was to set a realistic budget that then actually forced, it was not a gold-plated budget. It forced a lot of hard thinking within the ODA about how to redesign the part to reduce cost, make them and be as efficient as possible. Then have some quite tight and effective controls over the contingency. So there was a 3-layer contingency. John had some that was within his control that could incentivize. We had some that was in our control that was in our role as oversight. And then finally behind us there were the big bad beasts in the Treasury who we always said it was absolutely impossible to get any money out of them, and they were the ultimate gatekeepers. And that triple sort of control, I think, with the knowledge that the money was there if it was absolutely needed and could be spent, but with that strong control actually incentivized a lot of value.
And where that comes into the theme of accountability and decisiveness is that by giving Sir John a realistic budget with a good contingency and one where he wasn't going to have to come back year after year and say, okay, we've spent it all, we need a little bit more. You do, to some extent, reduce the chain of accountability, but you make it much more possible to be decisive, don't you? So in this, just final comment from you each, in this, if you like, trade-off between accountability and decisiveness, of not putting, let's take John as the one who was delivering the biggest chunk of this, not looking over his shoulder too much, looking over his shoulder not every minute, but every year, did that make for a better project? And do sometimes we maybe have a tendency to make people so accountable they can't get the job done?
Yeah, I mean, looking at Simon over there, who was our director responsible for all the roads, bridges, and the infrastructure around the park and the stadium, I suspect Simon wouldn't feel that he was not under pretty heavy pressure on value for money and cost, and this was the most audited job that I have ever seen. I mean, David Higgins, who was chief executive for most of the time with the ODA, David said to me one day, he said, "I think we've got 10 levels of audit here, John." And there were 10 different, we had 2 or 3 internal ones within the ODA. There was the NAO, there was the mayor, and DCLG had created another one around sustainability. We had external auditors in the way that you would normally have them, and so on. And so there was an enormous amount of checking going on all the time. The contractors complained that they were being over-supervised. We actually spent more money on this project managing and supervising than would normally be the case. Now, I think we got value from that. I think that there was actually benefit in that level of oversight and that level of constant measurement and checking on, were we within budget? What were the risks? Risk reviews were just continuous, and trying to identify what are the risks coming up in the next month, what are the risks in the next 6 months. Have we got a hang of those? And the biggest one, of course, that was alluded to just now by Jonathan, was of course the whole business around the village, where the village was going to be provided by the private sector, and then at the last minute, because of the financial crisis, the private sector could not come up with a worthwhile financial package, and we had to go back to Treasury and say, look, sorry guys, we're going to have to spend some of the contingency, we're going to have to spend a large slug of public money to build this village, but trust us, we'll get it back at the end of the day when circumstances are better. That was probably one of the most difficult moments. But I think, again, what I think was, we were never ever held up as the ODA for a government decision. And I think this was absolutely critical. And this was alluded to by Jonathan again. I think it was the relationships which enabled that. Particularly the relationship which we had between our commercial director and Jonathan's commercial director. The fact those two guys would spend hours together arguing backwards and forwards, but always recognizing they were going to have to give and take, they were going to have to get to a decision point because we could not afford for the decision to be held up. And then for Jonathan's guy to be able to go to Jonathan and his colleagues and say, right, this is what I think is a sensible deal that we've just done with the ODA over this, that, or the other. But it was, I think, that nobody ever relaxed because you couldn't. You couldn't afford to say, well, we'll spend another week arguing about this. Right. We haven't got another week, so people have just got to stick there all night if necessary and get to the point where there is an agreement.
But come in, Jonathan, and then I'll open it.
I bet if you got these guys being really honest, they would say at times they thought we were completely over their shoulders and asking too many questions and everything like that. But actually, that in part was our job. There's £9.3 billion of public money, of taxpayers' money, of council taxpayers' money. You've got 30 people or so in DCMS sort of seeking to account for that and assure for value for money. That's pretty good value as well.
Okay. All right, well, I've raised some themes. Questions, comments. We'll have a roving mic, I believe, and we'll take. We've got a couple over here, and just tell us who you are. Just always good for us to know.
Clive Bates, I'm from Department for Energy and Climate Change. Could I ask you about PFI? You put a lot of stress on this, an alignment of incentives, the importance of contingency with incentives not to consume the contingency, advanced contracts like your target price contract rather than fixed price contracts. Yet the dominant form of contracting for infrastructure is still the PFI. It doesn't seem to square that well with those sort of principles. And I just thought I would ask you about it, you obviously know more than I do, ask you about it, whether there are lessons that could be learnt for PFI from your experience.
This is for Sir John, I think, isn't it, really? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I was involved very heavily in one of the very first PFIs. The first PFI in this country, I think, was the Dartford crossing, and the second one was the Severn crossing. Now, on the Severn crossing, I was the contractor, and so I had a lump sum, fixed price contract, basically, to build a bridge. And the first thing I did was go to the designer and incentivize him. And I said to him, look, we've won this flipping thing, shock horror, and we're now going to have to build it for the price that I have got here, that there's nowhere else I can go and get any more money. This is our money as the contractor. So I will pay you, I will share with you 50-50 every pound that you can save me in designing this thing, in material content. But don't make it more complicated to build while you're doing it. So that was the trade-off. And he was horrified. You know, we're consulting engineers. We don't sort of do that sort of thing. And fortunately, there was a joint venture with a French designer. And the French designer said, "Oh yeah, have some of that." And in fact, it worked very well. They kept it. We kept it within budget, and they made some extra money. I can't understand why everybody is so critical of PFI. If there is a failure of PFI, it is just a failure of procurement, in which people, they constantly see all the risk being in construction. The risk is not in construction. Buildings cost a lot more in operation than they ever do in construction, and little attention was paid in many of the PFI contracts to the ongoing operational side of these contracts. And if you screw people down on the capital cost, then don't be surprised if they get it back by charging you 60 quid to change the light bulb. You know, I mean, but nobody paid any attention, I suspect, to that aspect of these contracts. And all we should do now, I think, is learn from those experiences, recognize that if you want to invest, governments cannot afford to invest at the scale which is required. You've got to get the private sector involved as well.
But the problem with the PFI, as I understand it, was more on the F really than the P. And the issue is whether now we think you know how to run a construction project, we shouldn't just employ you with your NEC3 contract to just build the infrastructure rather than PFIing it. Borrow the money as government, and build anything. We could get you to build nuclear power stations, or we can borrow the money. We know we can do that pretty cheaply at the moment. And there's really almost no need for the PFI. If you've got a better contract form that allocates risk and incentives well, the whole point of getting the F into PFI was around giving them the incentive to do it well. But you've got the incentive, you've found a way of getting them to do it well without getting them to raise the money.
Yes, the weakness of the public sector, quite frankly, is that by and large it takes too long, it can't make its mind up, and by and large it doesn't really know what it wants. And it's too intelligent. And what I mean by that is that you can always persuade with a very intelligent, rational argument a public servant to your point of view. Because that's what he does. He understands that. He enjoys that. A commercial private sector client does not, does he, Paul? I mean, he just says, bugger off. I haven't got any more money. And therefore the pressure on you as a supplier to the private sector is I think, that much greater to resolve these issues. And that's what you ought to be buying as government when you enter into PFI, is getting the private sector to actually put the pressure on in the way that only the private sector can, to deliver something which has got much tighter budgetary and controls around it. And so that's why I would say I think it is in government's interest to actually continue to work at PFI and find the right balance for it, rather than just ditch it, as one sometimes senses they would like to.
More questions? We've got a cluster here in this corner. Yeah.
Robert Morland, I think I've no credentials beyond enjoying 3 sessions of ladies' beach volleyball across the road. A very rewarding experience. But first of all, congratulations. And if I may say so, I would hope I would have everyone's agreement in saying when you were talking about why you got the games and the inspiration to the young, etc., you achieved that in spades, I thought. And certainly all the comments I have had worldwide underline that. Although what intrigues me, the most of my emails I've got from friends abroad about the success of how did the Queen manage to do it with James Bond. But my question really comes from that, in the sense I thought also from many of the comments at the time was that the legacy was also supposed to be a kind of regeneration one about the infrastructure of the area, etc. Do you feel you're achieving that? I mean, I'm conscious that the stadium's going to be empty for 2 years. And if I may ask a slightly cheeky question, you've talked about all the successes which you deserve to talk about. Were the things that happened not as well that you didn't expect? I don't want to talk about the security issue, but I found London was much emptier than I expected. I got loads of tickets for the theatre very easily during August. I mean, were the big things that didn't happen?
Thank you very much, Robin. Yeah, I think these are questions for Jonathan. So there is an interesting question about what actually went wrong. Of course, some things must have gone, some things must have gone wrong. But the first part too.
So on the physical legacy in East London, John will add something on this. That was actually has been a central part of planning right from the very start with the design of the park. So decisions on which structures were permanent, which structures were temporary, was, I mean, significantly driven by what was the legacy need and uses. And I think also the critical point
But did that work? Did that work? I mean, because the stadium, you know, had to be an athletic stadium, mustn't be a white elephant. Not clear that those are two compatible objectives, really, and it's a problem, isn't it, really?
And you know, the stadium is the one out of the 8 significant venues that is still, the end use of which is still being resolved, although we've got, you know, it's a source of future events with the 2017 Athletics Championship happening there. But actually the park and the impact on East London is far more than individual venues. It's the opportunity for residential housing, for business development around the park, with the IBC MPC, for example, being used as a sort of future business park.
Is that sorted, the media centre? Is that all the broadcast centre?
Yeah,
it is
with a preferred
you've got
bidder
clients
identified
and
all that. And that is now actually also handed over to, in political terms, the one with the closest interest in that area, the mayor. So the mayor and his development corporation actually will take over the land and all of that. And in terms of transformation of the park, I mean, what is happening now, John again is more expert on this, what is happening now is the translation from what was necessary from Games time, which included a lot of temporary structures and temporary bridges, into what is permanent and planned to last for good. So that will happen over the course of the next year and 2 years in particular.
And let's just ask, because I thought the follow-up question was interesting, the second part. If you each had to cite the thing that really did go wrong, probably let's exclude G4S. We've heard all about G4S. What were the things that you think there were lessons from failure in the delivery of these games? Paul, maybe you can start.
You know, it's a smart-ass answer, but you know, really, if we'd have had the confidence about just how good it was going to be, the way you'd have been able to sell it and get really stuck into aspects of the legacy earlier would have been powerful. So we've never gripped as powerfully as we need to the inspiring young people into sport. You know, we've got bits and pieces in place. We've never quite had the cross-party agreement on how to do that we need. And I think if we'd all really believe, you know, you're so focused on, my God, are we ever going to be able to do this? If you, and everybody says this when you do it, when you get there, wow. And I think we would have, you know, we would have put ourselves in a position to allow our young people to benefit from more sporting opportunities and done more things in that area.
Participation, you mean, along the participation,
all sorts of opportunities, and we'd be further advanced with that because we'd have done it through the games, and we'd now really be launching ourselves. I mean, Jonathan have a point of view. You know, another level on.
Yeah.
So I think there's a bit of an
You
opportunity.
could have had a 10 million
there.
people doing a 5K run or something during the games, couldn't you? When
Something
people-
sustainable. We really could have
Maybe on the
captured
first
that.
anniversary we can.
And that's so we're
that's it.
we're a bit.
Yeah.
It's the opportunity is all still there, but we really, I think, could have done something extraordinary with it, given the inspirations just dripping off the walls.
So John, what was your biggest failure?
Our biggest failure in a purely measured against our objective sense was our ability to build into the park renewable energy sources to a level of 20%, which was the target that we set ourselves. So 20% of the energy required by the park would come from renewable sources. And we put a lot of we put a lot of effort into and backed the use of wind power for that. And we spent 3 years trying to make it work, and in the end couldn't make it work and had to ditch it as a solution, by which time it was too late to go back and re-engineer. I mean, the interesting thing, I have to say about renewable energy is that basically, they are expensive. And even if we'd gone back and said, well, let's cover more roofs with photovoltaics, we would not have been able to say that was value for money. We'd have simply been doing it in order to meet an objective. So what we did was we did an offset deal. And in a sense, the money that we were going to spend on wind turbines, we actually gave to the local boroughs and said, well, look, you use this and spend it within your boroughs on existing buildings where, in fact, you can improve their CO2 footprint by actually putting more insulation in and so on. So that was how we spent the money. But that was, I think, an interesting
that's an interesting one. We haven't heard
issue.
much about that.
I mean, I think the other, I'm not sure it was a mistake. I've got to be careful what I say, because obviously the negotiations are going on around the stadium at the moment. But the stadium is a very interesting example, and brings us back to the beginning point about value for money and so on. Because when we had the debate about the stadium 4 or 5 years ago, the driver was it had to be an athletic stadium. We were going to seek to avoid a white elephant, so we deliberately designed a stadium which you could dismantle. So giving us an athletic stadium, so we didn't have a white elephant. And we rejected the opportunity, because it would have added quite a lot more money, for another 20% of cost to the stadium.
Have we got a sound engineer around? It's okay. Sorry. Okay. There's something going wrong. It's none of our mics. It must be one of the others.
Now, given that decision, if you remember, would have been made 4 or 5 years ago, the decision to therefore spend another 20% on the stadium at a time when clearly we were all wanting to keep the budget down and not spend money which we couldn't be certain of. The fact that nobody wanted a stadium at that point, so we couldn't get anybody out there saying, yes, we'd like to have an 80,000 seat stadium, drove us to actually make what I think was the right decision at the time, to go for a totally flexible, demountable stadium. Roll forward 5 years, and everybody says, well, you're not going to take it down, are you? We love it.
We won 3 gold medals on that Saturday night. There's no way we're going to say goodbye to
Olympics. It's this wonderful stadium. But now we're in a situation where, of course,
we're stuck with one that doesn't work for football.
You're going to have to spend more money on it to make it work in a multiple way. So we'll probably spend more money today doing that than we would have spent
if we started out and designed it for flexibility
from the first place. So I think there's a very interesting debate around.
Quick, Jonathan.
It's an echo of the same point, that actually we were so concerned at setting the original budget to screw down on cost, to be very clear about specifying the scope, that for the sake of actually the margin that we have actually underspent by, or less than that, one could have had more, so that in the end, in 2012, we were scrabbling around to put together, an advertising budget for the great campaign overseas and everything like that. That had been integrated and seen as part of the project. We'd have been able to be more flexible and more focused on securing the benefits in 2012.
Okay. Right, questions. Who'd like to ask the next one? Yes, we'll have I think we'll come over here, actually. We've got someone in the second row. We've quite a bit from that cluster,
Thanks very much. My name's Una Muirhead. I'm going to extend this out, if I may, to sort of the benefits of the region and for the nations and regions, and how we kind of build on that. And if I just say that I started off in the LGA in July 2005, thinking, you know, how are we going to make this something that all councils think is for everybody, not just London. And then I ended up in Paul's extended team chairing the South East partnership for the Games as the chief executive of the then CEDA. And I think, first of all, absolutely fantastic job, absolute congratulations. It was superb. It surpassed everybody's expectations in the region, as well as, I think, in London and nationally and internationally. But, and I think there's a bit of a but here, let's not forget that outside of London, where you didn't have quite the we have got to get this by the deadline or else, it was much more difficult to get the impetus going and get everyone engaged. Okay, those local authorities that had venues, they had, you know, they didn't want to be humiliated, they wanted it to be fantastic, so there was a real incentive for them. But I think for the rest, it actually took quite a lot of effort to get the engagement that made the Torch, for example, such a fantastic
But what I'm right in saying, I mean, there were places all around the country who were hosting teams, and I mean, there were facilities that were upgraded and tarted up.
There were, but it was quite tough actually getting a focus on all of that. So part of it was the incentive of, in the South East, we can do better than any other region in terms of the number of training camps that we have. So there was a bit of that. And the things that for me really worked were firstly, the Nations and Regions team in LOCOG and the capacity that was put into the region. It wasn't very much. I mean, you know, I had one full-time person by, you know, for the last 2 years, and then there was a sort of cultural full-time person. Secondly, the frameworks, the national frameworks that were in place. So there was a cultural framework, which I think gave everyone a sense of purpose, but with enough in it for them to develop their own creativity. So I think that was really good. And I think out of that, for me, there's a question of how do we build on that in future, knowing now what we didn't know 5 years ago, and really get that, keep the momentum going next year, year after, and all of that, and how do we learn those lessons? And I think what I would say is, please don't forget volunteers, because they have got a huge capacity to do more, but they will need to be organised.
It's not just going to spontaneously happen.
The frameworks and capacity.
I don't know whether you want to pick up on that, Paul, or whether we hold that as a comment. I mean,
yeah, I mean, the making these a national games was a core part of the comm strategy of making it everyone's games, and I think the key was to deliver plausible opportunities to join in, whether it was by being a volunteer, winning a business contract, happening to have a venue close by, you know, joining into things that didn't require London centralisation. And I think if this hadn't have worked, the London versus the rest of us that would have come with it would have been,
could have been horrible.
Terrible. So so I think it was about as good as it possibly could be, given the fact the games are awarded to a city. You know, Beijing didn't do a lot for Shanghai. Believe me, Barcelona did nothing for Madrid. You know, you won't. You know, Sydney really didn't do anything for Melbourne. So actually taking on, really trying to get the country involved, and we don't talk about it, is quite a unique achievement in Olympic terms, because it's really hard to do, and nobody else even tried.
Interesting though, by mentioning culture, you reminded me of the other failure, which was the Cultural Olympiad, Jonathan. Did that really, I mean, I'm being a bit harsh.
You are.
Yes, no, you are.
Did did that ever really take off? Or did people really know what it was?
It was hugely successful. I mean, I thought it was the surprise success of 2012.
What, the Cultural Olympiad?
Yeah, right the way through, all the way through. I mean, how many millions of
19
people participated in it? It was one of the things.
19 people 19 or 19 million?
Because
19 million.
Because it could be distributed all
because that was the thing
country.
that was made it much better and more national. I agree.
Absolutely.
Maybe I just missed it.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, you clearly weren't at the sort of pop-up trapeze artists in Trafalgar Square, or the.
We launched it in Stirling.
I walked across Beachy Head in the darkness at sort of midnight one night to participate in a peace camp, which was part of the Cultural Olympiad, you know, down on the Sussex.
Okay, well, I apologise. It's okay. It's okay.
You missed out. You missed out.
I'm wrong.
People didn't associate it with this term cultural Olympiad.
No, okay.
We
Maybe
called
it
it Festival 2012
Right,
for last
festival-
year.
Yeah,
the
yeah,
climax
no,
of the
that's
last
right,
3 months, rather.
but I never quite felt it took off. But I really am. No, I stand corrected. Stand corrected. Another question. Yes, the guy at the back there with the lovely.
Hi, I'm Perry. I'm a development manager for a charity called Cricket for Change. My question comes from something that you said, Paul, at the start about the Singapore promise and inspiring a generation that we all talk about all the time. But it can probably be answered by sort of any one of you, really. We work with Afghan refugees to young people who have severe disabilities to, young people who are in gangs. And we are very much led by young people for young people. And my question is, in terms of the planning and decision making leading up to the games, was any of that led by young people?
Yes. No, it's a great point. I I often, you're right. You look around the room and you think we're all talking about, and look at us. How can this be right? It particularly because we had a program of hiring school leavers. And I remember, which was very successful. It's great. It was one of the ways we brought young people into the organisation. We got kids straight out of school, and they had a tremendous impact on the organisation. I remember one of them saying, he said, so what do you find difficult in Australia? He said, just so many old people here. It's really. But structurally, we actually got together we were involved, Richard, a young people's group of. Combinate people at the last year at school, first years at college, who met on a monthly basis, and we allocated them to specific groups to help with things like branding, developing our education program, worked on our website, because we were claiming to be the great digitally connected games, but we needed to talk the language that our target market was communicating in, and so we needed those young people to help us. So we tried our best to tap it on. We did a fair bit of it, but you can never do enough.
I've got a gentleman here. We've got time for a couple more questions. We'll take one here. Is there someone else who wants to? If we can get a mic to. No, you go.
Simon Judge, Department for Education. You've obviously been talking about a project that has a reasonably defined timescale, cost, and quality. A lot of us across government are working on transforming public services, which whether it's education or criminal justice or health, which are programs that probably never end, have unclear scope and very unclear timing. What are the sort of key lessons you think can be applied from what you've done on delivering a particular project to those sorts of programs?
Well, I have to say, it always strikes me, this is where government fails in delivering, is that they don't break it down into identifiable deliverable packages in a sensible time frame. Most people can't think beyond next week. If you took an army analogy, the general is concerned about the war. The captain is concerned about tomorrow's battle, and the squaddie is concerned about this morning. And they will all have their objectives defined within what they are seeking to do within different time frames. And it seems to me that the lesson, everything we do in life, it ought to be a project. We get ourselves out of the house efficiently in the morning when we don't actually upset our routine. But the moment we actually have a slightly different routine, you get down the road and you think, bugger me, I've left my rail pass behind. Because I didn't go through that routine that I would go through every single morning. And
it's quite revealing, John.
And therefore and I think, if you can actually break things down into where you can measure what it is you're trying to do, you can celebrate success, and you haven't got to wait 3 years to celebrate success. You can celebrate success after 3 months, and people can see what it is they've done. We did this a lot